Today's class is our second class on contracts, and we will be looking at these three problems today. February 91 question, Tech Data, February 93, and July 05. This question is a change from the one that was scheduled, and I did that because this is a better question for our purposes, and I didn't realize that at the time I originally made the assignment. We will begin with the sand-barb question from July 05. First, I want to do a quick review of the law of contracts. I know we've reviewed it before, but it never hurts to do a quick review. You recall that the law of contract is easily dividable into these six parts: formation of contract, certain problems with interpreting the meaning of the contract, meaning of the words and sentences, changes in the contract, breach of contract, remedies for breach of contract, and quasi-contract to prevent unjust enrichment in those cases where the parties either did not have a contract or they had a contract and it came to an end in the middle of the proceeding, and you got to give people back their stuff. A quick review of each of these would be convenient. Formation of the contract, you recall, requires mutual assent, and there's some rules about how you establish mutual assent, consideration, and no effective defenses. There's a list of the effective defenses. Secondly, these are some of the areas that we will be looking at today: parole evidence rule, ambiguity, and mistake. Now, the parole evidence rule, to say a little bit more about these areas, because these are the areas we'll be looking at today, is a rule that deals with the problem of, if you have a writing, was that writing intended to be the final and complete expression of the parties, so that nothing that you said ahead of time while you were still negotiating can be used to add to, vary, or contradict the terms? For example, you and I form a contract, and in the contract, you're going to buy my car, and I write a note. The car is the value of more than $500 or more, so we need a writing. So I write a note. I say, car, $4,000, and sign it. Well, is that writing intended to be the complete contract? Doesn't say which car, doesn't say who's buying, who's selling. So that writing obviously is not enough, and it wasn't intended to be the final and complete expression of the subject. On the subject, you expected something more. And so now obviously I can make the writing more and more complete, and you now have this fuzzy question of, at what point did we intend for that writing to be the complete expression? And if we intended for the writing to be the final and complete expression, then things that we said ahead of time, things that we said along the way when we were negotiating, letters that we exchanged, phone calls that we exchanged, all those things that went on before we got to the final and complete expression, that stuff cannot be used to add to, vary, or contradict the terms, because the terms we ended up with were intended to be it. Now, this has nothing to do with modifying the contract after it's formed. We're not talking about that. We're talking about things that were said before we had this final and complete writing. And so the parole evidence rule here deals with is a rule that says, if we intended for the writing to be our final and complete expression, then things that we said ahead of time, things that we said while negotiating prior to making this final agreement, a written agreement may not be used to add to vary or contradict the terms. The problem that you will see when we deal with the parole evidence rule is that how do you determine whether or not we intended for the writing to be the final and complete expression? That's the fuzzy boundary, and that's what the problem is always about on the bar exam. There are two views on this, and we'll talk about these views. There's the Williston view, and there is the Corbin view of deciding how you intended for the parties, for the writing to be the final and complete expression. And we'll come back and talk about the Williston view and the Corbin view, because that's what you need to do on the bar exam. When the parole evidence rule comes up, talk about both of these views so you can get all the points. Both of these views of how you determine whether or not the writing was intended to be integrated, final and complete expression. Ambiguity, where there is ambiguity, you try to determine the intent of the parties. Ambiguity, try to determine the intent of the parties. And there are devices for doing that, but that's for your basic purpose. In the case of mistake, if a contract, if there's a mistake as to an essential term of the contract, a basic term as it's called, you can rescind for that mistake. The parties either have no contract at all, or if they have a contract, you can rescind. Generally, we say the contract simply was not formed. If there's a mistake as to a basic term and it had a material effect on the outcome, there simply was no contract at all if there was that kind of mistake. Now, there's another type of mistake in contract law where really all you're doing is making a typing error. So if you and I, for example, form a contract, and we form the contract and over the telephone, and then I write it down, and I write it down badly, I type it badly, well, that doesn't change our contract. We formed the contract over the telephone, even though it was oral. And now I write it down badly, that didn't change anything. You just reformed the document so that it conforms to our original intent. So in that type of mistake, it's just a typing error. But the other type of mistake where it's more serious is where there's a real misunderstanding. And there's no misunderstanding if we form the contract over the telephone and I type it badly. But if there's a real misunderstanding, then that's the other type of mistake. In that case, we'll either some jurisdictions say that we didn't form a contract at all, and others simply say that that's the basis for rescinding. So parole evidence rule, ambiguity, mistake, important here, and we'll be looking at these today. Last week we looked at a lot of material on formation. Next, changes in the contract. Now, it is very common that after the contract has been formed, that people want to change the contract. After the contract has been formed, there is a desire to change it, and if you want to change the terms of the contract, that's a modification or waiver. If you want to change the people in the contract, that is assignment, delegations, or a third-party beneficiary contract, or revoking the rights of third parties. In other words, you form a third-party beneficiary contract, and then you revoke the third party's rights, and that's changing the people also. In the case of modifying the contract, right here, if you want to modify a contract, the three things you have to watch for are, number one, did the parties agree on the new terms? If they agree, that's the A here, did they agree on the new terms? Secondly, in some circumstances, you need new consideration for a modification. The common law rule required new consideration. But as you probably know, under the UCC, the general rule is that no consideration is needed for the modification of a contract. All you need is good faith. And finally, look to defenses to the formation of the contract. These defenses to formation of the contract right here are the same as these defenses right here. Defenses to modification and defenses to formation are the same list. So Formation of the contract, these are the main things. Interpretation, changes, breach of contract. Every bar exam question that has ever been on the bar has a breach issue, major breach issue, breach of contract. The requirement, how do you decide if a contract has been breached? The basic rule is that a breach of contract is the non-performance of a contract duty which has become absolute. The non-performance of the contract duty which has become absolute, and so the question becomes, how do you decide whether or not a contract duty has become absolute? So, breach of contract is the non-performance of a contract duty which has become absolute. When does a contract duty become absolute? 3 requirements, and here they are. All conditions precedent to someone's duty to perform have either occurred or been excused. This particular excuse of duty here, substantial performance, is a big deal. Tested a lot. Secondly, time for performance must have arrived. If you have a duty, but time for your duty to arrive isn't here yet, of course there's no breach. But there are some exceptions. Time for performance must have arrived, or in the cases of anticipatory repudiation, you don't have to wait for time for performance to arrive. Voluntary disablement, you don't have to wait. Also, prospective inability to perform is the same stuff. You don't have to wait. And finally, for the breach to have occurred, you need all conditions precedent have occurred or been excused, time for performance has arrived, or you don't have to wait, and the duty has not been previously discharged. Now, if the duty has been, how do you decide if the duty has been previously discharged? Well, you have a list in your materials, but here are some of the most common ones. Impossibility. You can't paint my boat because it sank. Frustration of purpose. The bar examiners had an excellent example of frustration of purpose where a person was building a house, and after they had the contract to build a house, the person was building a house, and after they had the contract to build a house, the owner then entered into another contract with the builder to build a garage next door to the house. Well, this house was being built on a cliff, on a hill, on a mountain, so you could overlook the valley. And an unprecedented storm came along and washed away the house just as it was finished. But the garage wasn't finished yet because it got started later. Now you can see it wasn't possible to rebuild the house because the way the land washed away from the unprecedented storm, you couldn't rebuild a house there. So there's no point in finishing the garage. Frustration of purpose. That terminated the duty. Modification. You can modify a contract in such a way that certain duties have been discharged. Statute of limitations, of course. Performance. A duty that has been performed once doesn't need to be performed again. And there are a bunch of others that you will see in your notes. So the breach of contract then occurs when these 3 requirements have been satisfied. If there's been a breach, we look for remedies. Remedies for the breach, as we studied in remedies, are damages, restitution, and specific performance. The damages, benefit of the bargain, reliance damages, incidental damages, and liquidated damages, just as we talked about in our remedies class. We had a special class on this subject of remedies. We have another one coming up also. Benefit of the bargain must be actual, causal, foreseeable, unavoidable. Reliance damages must be actual, causal, foreseeable, and unavoidable. Incidental damages must be actual, causal, foreseeable, and unavoidable. and then liquidated damages, which don't have those requirements. Restitution does not have those requirements. And finally, specific performance there's a list of requirements for specific performance. Finally comes the item 6, quasi-contract. Quasi-contract is used to prevent unjust enrichment, and we need to prevent unjust enrichment where, for example, you performed work for me thinking that we had a contract when in fact turns out we didn't. Or we had a contract and partway through it was terminated by destruction of the subject matter or by frustration of purpose. And so what do you do when the contract has been partly performed and now you can't complete it? Well, you restore people to their pre-contract position as best you can. And that's what quasi-contract is about. Now, with those ideas in mind, we want to look at some questions to analyze questions using this structure. And we will begin with the question from July '05. The July '05 question, the one involving Stan and Barb, reads as follows. Again, I will read the question and identify issues as we go along because it's easier to follow the discussion that way. If I just started with the call of the question and wrote out the answer, it wouldn't be as easy to connect the issues with the facts as they are presented here. So as we go through, we'll identify the issues and so let's do that. Line 7. Stan and Barb entered into a valid written contract whereby 1. Stan agreed to convey to Barb 100 acres of agricultural land and water right in an adjacent stream. So this is a contract to convey an interest in real property. Statute of frauds applies. It's in writing. That's fine. The writing needs to contain the parties, the subject matter. Subject matter in this case is the land that they're going to convey. The parties, the subject matter, the quantity. If it were UCC, this is not UCC, so you don't have quantity. Parties, subject matter, quantity, and price, and time for performance. Item 2, line 7. Barb agreed to pay $100,000. So you can see you have all the essential terms in writing. When Stan and Barb were negotiating the deal, Stan said, quote, "You know, I want to make sure this property will still be used for farming and not developed." And that's what Stan orally said to Barb. Barb replied simply, quote, "Well, I can certainly understand your feelings," close quote. In fact, Barb intended to develop the land as a resort. Oops. Do we have a problem here? And the answer is yes, we do. What is the problem? Probably fraud. Why? Let's pull out the definition of fraud and see if we have it. Now, fraud is tested from time to time. It's often called a remedies problem when it is tested. We have to know the elements of fraud. Now, the elements of fraud that I'm going to give you now are the ones you use for contract purposes and so forth. They're not for wills. If someone has committed fraud in the execution of a will, it's a subset of this. You don't need all of this for that. We'll talk about that in wills. But for fraud, it's got a lot of elements. And I don't know any other way to deal with this except to memorize it. Fraud, first of all, is the misrepresentation of a material fact say with scienter for intent to induce reliance 5, actual reliance. Number 6, reasonableness of the reliance, or it's sometimes called justifiable reliance. In other words, what we're saying here is that you can't act a fool and rely on stuff that no reasonable person would rely on and then expect the other person to pay you for it. So your reliance has to be reasonable. And number 7, damages. Now, the misrepresentation I need to expand on further. Material fact is self-explanatory. Scienter simply means a bad state of mind. In other words, the person it wasn't an accident. They knew they were making a misrepresentation. Intent to induce reliance, that's self-explanatory. Actual reliance is self-explanatory. Reasonableness, I explained already, and damages. This one, number 1, is the one where the problem usually occurs. In a bar exam question, usually the facts make items 2 through 7 fairly clear. It's item 1 that's the problem. Now, the misrepresentation can occur in basically 2 ways. It can be what's called affirmative misrepresentation. That's just plain old lying, and with a fancy name. But the other way the misrepresentation can occur is failure to disclose where there's a duty to disclose. And this is the one that's usually tested. Failure to disclose where there's a duty to disclose. So of course the question becomes, when is there a duty to disclose? And so let's make a list of some of those. Number 1, situations where there's a duty to disclose. One has a duty to disclose to your fiduciary. Number 2, and that's obvious, duty to disclose everything to your fiduciary. Secondly, there is a duty to disclose in several other cases. One is the half-truth case. The half-truth case is the case where you tell someone half the truth, and you know that they are relying on that as being the entire story, and that they're going to be injured if they rely on that as being the entire story when you know it's not. So you give them half the truth, and you know they're going to rely on it. Got to disclose the rest of it. Third situation where there's a duty to disclose is the new information. The new information case is the case where you tell the person something that you believe to be true at the time, but after you have told them that, when you thought it was true, you get new information and discover, oops, it's not true after all. And you know the person's going to be relying on that being the truth, and so you have to disclose the new information to them. Number 4 is the new reliance. The new reliance cases. Well, the new reliance cases are those cases where you told somebody something, you knew it wasn't true at the time, but you were maybe failed puffing or something of that sort. And now you find out after the fact that the person is going to rely on what you told them. So that new reliance case should, one has to disclose the truth in that case. And then the 5th case is the one where, I'm not sure how to say this in a word or two, but this is a case where I know something about the product that I'm selling to you, and I know something about it that's material, that materially affects the value of the product, but you don't know it and you can't find out without unreasonable hardship. For example, I have a Mona Lisa, and it's a copy, and you don't know it. I know it. It has fooled several museums, and so it's a very good copy. And now I'm going to sell it to you, and I don't, make an affirmative misrepresentation. Because if I just say to you, this is the original Mona Lisa, that's an affirmative misrepresentation, takes care of that. But we're not talking about that case. We're talking about the case where I don't say anything, and you buy it, and I know that you think it's the real one, but it's not. You can't find out easily. I have a duty to disclose. You are buying my house, and my house is on landfill, and it's in an earthquake area, where when there are earthquakes and houses on landfill get badly damaged. And you can't find out that my house is on landfill without doing a geological study of some sort. And you don't know to do that. You don't have reason to think that's the case. But I know. I'm selling you a house in the summertime in Kansas, where when it rains in the wintertime, it pours. And my roof leaks, but you don't know that it leaks badly, and you can't find out without a fair amount of work. And so in those kinds of cases where I have information which materially affects the value of what I'm about to convey to you, and you can't get that information without unreasonable hardship, there's a duty to disclose. And so I'm just going to put here, for lack of a better term, hardship. But you understand what it's really all about. Now, so these are the cases where there is a duty to disclose, and if you don't disclose in this case, it amounts to a form of misrepresentation. Now, in our case, we have that because we have the half-truth case. The reason we have the half-truth case is because because Stan said to Barb, I don't want the land developed, and Barb said, yes, I understand your feeling. But that is obviously misleading, and it's a half-truth, kind of. Yes, I understand your feelings, but you can see how you can argue that that qualifies as a half-truth. And therefore, she should have fully disclosed, and she didn't. Therefore, you have a misrepresentation by Barb of a material fact, namely how the land is going to be developed. Scienter, she knew she was lying. She intended to induce Stan to rely on this. Stan actually relied. His reliance was reasonable. And will he be damaged? Well, you can make a sentence or two about that. And he's going to get his money, and so he's not damaged in the sense of not getting paid. But he has an interest that he wants to sell the land and to have it developed in a particular way, or not have it developed in a particular way. And he has a right to do that if he wants to, and certainly has a right not to be misled about how it's going to be developed. And you can call that a damage. It's not a money damage, but it qualifies as damage. So Stan, you may have fraud then. And indeed, if Barb has committed fraud, then that's a defense to the enforcement of this contract. So let's go back to the contract that she formed. Stan and Barb formed the contract. So we are at line 9 and 10. Line 9, Barb, Line 9, Barb replied simply, well, I can certainly understand your feelings. And we think that that's a half-truth, and it's a half-truth, and therefore I think we have an intentional misrepresentation. Remember, fraud and intentional misrepresentation and deceit are all the same stuff. So I think we have it here. New paragraph. And so what that means, of course, is that Stan really has a reason to rescind the contract. when people have induced you to form a contract by fraud, you can rescind it. So Stan has a right to rescind. Let's keep going. The conveyance was to take place on June the 1st. Okay? On May 15th, now that's 15 days early, so you got to watch out here, because when we get to the breach of contract, one of the requirements for a breach of contract is that time for performance has arrived. But what the events that are about to happen now happened on May 15th, or 15 days before time for performance has arrived. So time for performance will not have arrived, and we're going to have to use anticipatory repudiation. But let's keep going. Line 12. The conveyance was to take place on June the 1st. On May 15th, Stan called Barb and told her the deal was off. Stan said that a third party named Tom had offered him $130,000 for the land. Well, now this is interesting. Tom has offered him $130,000. I wonder if Tom knows about the contract between Barb and Stan, because Tom might be inducing breach of contract or interference with economic advantage or interference with contract. Any of that kind of stuff will do. Inducing breach, you need the actual breach. Interference with contract, you just make the contract more expensive or more difficult to perform. So, continuing at line 14, Stan said that a third party, Tom, had offered $130,000 for the land. So I don't know if we're going to be asked about Tom, but you keep in mind, you may have interference with contract if Tom knows and intended to induce a breach. Stan also said that he had discovered that Barb intended to develop the land. Now, Stan has a right to rescind for fraud. So if he's just discovered the fraud, Stan has a right to rescind. Stan does not have a right to rescind just because Tom offered him more money. But Stan does have a right to rescind for fraud. And we've just established the fraud. Line 17. On May 16, Barb discovered that Stan had title to only 90 of the 100 acres. Well, what do you do in that case? If someone's going to sell you land and it says 100 acres and you really don't have 100 acres. Well, the rule is that often you will see these contracts written as 100 acres more or less. And even if you don't say 100 acres more or less, it's kind of taken to mean 100 acres more or less because, the precise to the micro acre is not what people mean by that. And so typically when you are buying land and it says, or selling land, and it says 100 acres, it means 100 acres more or less. Now, if it's fairly close, and there's no exact number here, but if it's fairly close to the 100 acres more or less, then the contract stands and the price stands and no changes. However, if it is significantly less than the 100 acres, then the seller has to abate the purchase price to reduce it down to what it's worth now. So in this case, 90 acres is significantly less than 100 acres. So the purchase price would have to be abated down to the 90 acres. Also, finally, if the acreage is small enough, smaller enough than what was bargained for, then the buyer simply doesn't have to buy at all. You can say, you promised me 100 acres, you've only got 90, I don't want to buy it. That's probably enough so that Barb could just refuse to buy at all if she wanted to. Certainly it's enough if Barb still wants to buy to get an abatement in the purchase price, so she'd be entitled to that. Now, Barb could sue for breach of contract because if he promised her 100 acres and he's only got 90, and if 90 is not considered close enough, then she could sue for breach of contract, but she apparently doesn't want to do that. She apparently wants to buy the land anyway, and so we continue. We continue at line 17. Line 17, Barb, on May 16th, Barb discovered that Stan had title to only 90 of the 100 acres and that he did not have the water rights in the adjacent stream. Well, he promised her water rights, and he doesn't have them. And that's a breach of contract. So she could refuse to buy and sue for the benefit of her bargain. But she doesn't want to do that. She wants to buy the land anyway. And she wants to buy it anyway. She's not getting everything she bargained for, and so she still wants to buy. She is entitled to abatement of the purchase price. She could, on the alternative, buy the land and sue him for the $15,000 difference in the that to get the money she had to spend to get the water rights. But of course, why pay him the money and sue him for the difference? She would simply abate the purchase price, pay him $15,000 less. Line 23. What equitable and contractual rights, if any, may Barb seek? What defenses can Stan assert? What is the likely outcome? Well, the Barb can seek to enforce the contract by specific performance. She can, but the problem is that when she tries to enforce the contract, Barb has to establish the breach, of course. When she tries to establish the breach, what she would do for Barb, since Barb is suing, let's go through that. Since Barb is the person suing, we would say, we were given that the contract was formed, but there is an effective defense, namely, the written contract showed mutual assent, it showed consideration. Don't argue about how they got into mutual assent, because the facts tell you they agreed on these terms. So they agreed on the essential terms: parties, price, subject matter, time for performance. They agreed on consideration. There was consideration. They agreed on it. There is a defense. The defense is fraud. You point out the fraud, as we just did. That is the and so Stan doesn't have to sell if he doesn't want to. The parole evidence rule. Well, the parole evidence rule is an interesting issue here because what Barb is going to say is that Stan doesn't want to sell her the property because let's back up a second. Barb will say that the written contract which we have is a final and complete understanding of the parties. And it doesn't say anything about how the land will be developed or won't be developed. And that this is our final understanding, and therefore the parole evidence rule applies, and Stan cannot add to the contract some restriction on how the land will be developed, because that's what Stan wants to do. Says you can't develop it for resort purposes. It's got to still be farmed. So Stan is trying to impose this new obligation on the contract, and Barb will say, you can't do that. Parole evidence rule, here was our final writing. And in this case, was the writing intended to be the final and complete expression of the parties? The Williston view and the Corbin view are the two views that you should mention. The Williston view says to determine whether or not the writing was intended to be the final and complete expression of the parties. To determine that, what you should do is to look. The Williston view says look only at the document itself. Let me make sure that's clear. The Williston view says look only at the document. I'll put a big D here so it's clear. And if the document itself constitutes a contract that these people might have rationally formed, if the document itself constitutes a contract that these people might rationally have formed, then that is the contract, and you can't change it with things that they said before the contract was formed. For example, let me suppose that I am going to work for you as an employee, and we've formed a contract in writing, and the writing says you're going to pay me so much per year, and I'm going to do a certain kind of work. The contract doesn't say how long I'm going to work for you. And so let's suppose that we orally agreed over the telephone, I'm going to work for you for a year. But it's not in the written agreement. And so now, do I have a one-year contract with you or not? And the answer is, under the Willison view, you would look at only the document. And the document simply says, I'm coming to work for you at so much money per year. It doesn't say how long I'm going to be there. Well, if we might have rationally formed that kind of a contract, then that's the contract. And so there is no duration term. Under the Corbin view, we look at the intent of the parties. Under the Corbin view, we look at what does the parties actually intend? You look at the actual intent, and you can use any evidence which is relevant on the question of the intent of the parties. Now, if you and I have formed a contract and over the telephone we said 1 year, and let's suppose that we haven't violated the statute of frauds, make it 6 months if you want to, that we said 6 months over the telephone, now I can bring in that telephone conversation because that's what we intended. And so under Corbin's view, I can bring in, we tried to determine the real intent rather than determining the intent by looking only at the document. That's the formality. And the Corbin view says, no, try to figure out what the real intent was. And I can get a side hearing on what was our real intent. And we determine the real intent, and that's what works. So in our case, we have a writing between Barb and Stan. And that writing says that Barb is to buy and Stan is to sell. It doesn't say anything about how the land is going to be used. And therefore, Barb will say, parole evidence rule, you can't hold me to using it in any particular way. Stan's answer to that is that the fraud is an exception to the parole evidence rule. I can bring in oral statements to show fraud, and that's what you would use here, and that's why the fraud would work, and give Stan an out. So Barb is suing Stan, show the formation, it'll be brief, but show it. Talk about the parole evidence rule. We don't have anything else here. I don't think we have ambiguity. I don't think we have mistake. Changes, they're not trying to change the contract. And now comes the breach. Barb will say that Stan breached. She'll say that Stan breached because all conditions preceding to Stan's duty to convey have occurred. Time for performance has arrived. Stan's duty is not discharged. Well, there were no conditions preceding to Stan's duty to sell the land to her. But the time for performance has not arrived. However, this is a case of anticipatory repudiation. You should bring out the rule for anticipatory repudiation. This is a case where there's been no performance on either side, and one party announces that I will not perform. Well, you don't have to wait until time for performance to see if the person is really going to perform. You can sue now. And so Barb can sue now, even though it's only May 15th. She doesn't have to wait till June 1st when Stan tells her I'm not going to sell it. The voluntary disablement, it didn't happen in our case, but the voluntary disablement or prospective inability to perform, those are the cases that where I'm supposed to sell you my car, and before it's time for me to deliver the car to you, I sell the car to somebody else, and you find out about it. Well, you don't have to wait until the date I'm supposed to sell it to you. You already know I don't have it anymore, so you can sue now. That's a case of voluntary disablement. Or I'm supposed to perform for you at your theater, and you find out prior to the date when I'm supposed to perform to you that after I made the contract with you, I made another contract with somebody else to sing in New York or perform in New York, and I can't be there if I'm going to be here. And so you can see the breach coming. That's voluntary disablement. Prospective inability to perform right here is just another version of the same thing. Prospective inability to perform, I'll just put it right here. Prospective inability to perform. Prospective inability to perform is the case where I am to build a house for you. I'm to build a house, and it's an apartment building actually. It has 6 units in it. I'm supposed to build this 2-story apartment building, and it's supposed to complete by a certain date, and by say July 1st. You come out to see how I'm doing with this 6-unit apartment building on June 15th, 2 weeks before completion date. You come to look at it, and nothing has been done. Even where the foundation is supposed to be, there's still weeds there. And so I've done nothing. Now, I say to you when you come and look, I say to you, oh, don't you worry about a thing. I've got 2 weeks before the building is supposed to be finished. You just come back here in 2 weeks and you'll see this 6-unit apartment building here ready to occupy. Well, you don't have to believe that nonsense. And so that's prospective inability for me to perform. And when you've got that and it's clear enough, you can treat it just like anticipatory repudiation. Likewise, voluntary disablement can be treated just like anticipatory repudiation. So the breach has occurred now. In our case, we would use anticipatory repudiation. Barb would use it right here. So in the case of Barb suing Stan, she would say there were no conditions preceding to Stan's duty to perform. Time for performance has not arrived, but I can use anticipatory repudiation. I'll circle it right here. This is the one she's going to use. And she'll say that Stan's duty to perform has not been previously discharged by any of these methods, and therefore Stan has breached. She wants a remedy. None of this, of course, is going to work because she committed fraud, and the contract can be rescinded by Stan, and it was. But the remedy she would seek, the benefit of her bargain, she would look for abatement on the 10 acres, because the 10 acres short. She would look for abatement on the water rights, the $15,000 on water rights. There's no restitution. She wants specific performance, and in this problem they ask you about what remedies she might get. So specific performance, you can go right down the checklist for specific performance. The big problem, specific performance, you recall the elements are I'm doing fine, Mom and Dad. I is for inadequate remedy at law. In real property cases, real property is always considered unique, so the remedy at law is money, and that's inadequate. Definite contract terms, it's definite what is supposed to happen here, the land that Stan is supposed to convey to Barb. Feasible to enforce, of course the court can enforce this. Mutuality, if the courts make Stan convey, they'll make Barb pay. And defenses, in this case, Stan will have the defense of unclean hands, and that will stop her from being able to get specific performance. That is how you would analyze this question. We will take a break and come back and look at the next question, rather than take a full 10-minute break as we normally do, since this is pre-recorded for you today, so you can listen to it this evening. I'm simply going to take a 2-minute break, and you can stop your own computer if you want to take a longer break. So we'll take 2 minutes and start back.
It's easier for people to listen to what you're saying when they can see you talking. So if you stand, sometimes when you're over here and pointing to the board there, I'd much rather see you like right here, because then I can get the shot. But it's not really that super important.
I will try harder to do that also. It looks awkward when I'm halfway on the picture and halfway off.
Right. That's what I'm trying to avoid. But I don't always want it to be a super tight shot, because you gotta see, if you're always planning, I gotta see you talking every time.
But if you can, sometimes you have to turn that camera on and then, well, there's a delay because I assume my mic is off. The next question that we're going to look at is the question from the February 93 bar. This is the Delta Pratt question. And once again, we will read the question and analyze as we go. I am going to have to sit to do this one. So the question that we are about to analyze now is this question, the Delta Pratt question from the February 93 bar. We begin with the reading. Once again, I go through and identify issues this way so you can see what to write about. Obviously, the order in which you write about things depends on what you're asked. Line 5. Line 5, Delta is the owner of an equipment installation company. So Delta is the owner like a construction company or something. In May of 92, watch the date here, May, Pratt, a meat market owner, called Delta and asked whether Delta could install 6 used coolers, which Pratt had recently purchased. Okay, so this is obviously a contract for services, not sale of goods. I should mention to you that at the beginning of these problems, it'd be a good idea in your very first sentence to say whether the UCC or the common law applies to this kind of a problem, depending on whether it's a contract for the sale of goods or for services. So in all the problems, would you do that at the very beginning, please? Continuing, line 7. The coolers were to be installed in a new meat market that Pratt was opening. Pratt emphasized the need. Now, when you see someone emphasize something, watch it, because it's telling you either somebody's claiming the time is of the essence, or that the timing is really very important. So don't take that, when time is emphasized, don't take that lightly. Pratt, line 8. Pratt emphasized the need to complete the installation by July the 1st, in time for the new market grand opening on that day for the 4th of July holiday. Okay, so we understand what Pratt wants. And Pratt emphasized this, so Pratt told Delta. So Pratt and Delta both know that this timing is important to Pratt. Line 11. On May the 31st, where are we here? The end of May. Delta met with Pratt. And after a brief discussion, Pratt signed, now Pratt, not Delta, Pratt signed a form entitled Authorization Agreement. The document provided that, and here's what the document says. It says, in consideration of $12,000 to be paid on completion of the work, Delta will install in Pratt's market 6 used coolers, including pressurizing all cooling lines and calibrating the equipment for proper temperature within 30 days from the making of this contract. Okay, so Delta is supposed to do what it says and finish within 30 days of the making of this contract. Well, when is a contract made? Well, a contract is made when in this case, it'll be made when both parties have agreed. And in this case, they have a writing. It's probably when the writing is agreed upon. So far, Pratt has signed it, indicating Pratt agrees. But let's go to line 19. Delta told Pratt that Delta would send Pratt the executed contract as soon as Delta verified that Delta had the necessary compatible fittings for the valves on the used coolers. Well, so the contract isn't really formed yet, because you know the case, the case that says contract is formed upon dispatch of the acceptance, and my mind keeps saying Hadley versus Jacksonville. You know I don't mean that, but whatever the case is, I'll think of it in a minute. So the contract is formed upon dispatch of the acceptance. There's no special reason for that. The textbooks all say it is for historical reasons that's what people settled on. So this contract, it goes on to say at line 20 that on June 4th, having verified that the compatible equipment was on hand, Delta dated, signed, and sent the executed contract to Pratt. So really the contract was formed on June the 4th. 30 days from June the 4th is July the 4th. And so we have a problem with the contract, because the contract says finish 30 days from the making of this contract. So that is on July 4th. And yet, Pratt had emphasized the need to complete by July 1st, so they could be open for the holidays. So which is going to prevail? What the actual writing says, or what the parties talked about? Well, Let's talk about that for a moment. Parole evidence rule and ambiguity and mistake all can be discussed here. Parole evidence rule says that if the writing was intended to be the final and complete expression of the parties, you can't add to, vary, or contradict. Is this writing intended to be the final and complete expression of the parties? Well, if we go under the parole evidence rule here to the Willison view, Willison says look only at the documents themselves. And if you look only at the documents, this is a contract that these parties might rationally have formed. A contract to finish the work on July the 4th. And therefore, that is the contract. And so, it doesn't have to be finished until July the 4th. And the things that they said before the contract was formed, such as emphasizing the finishing date, cannot be used to add to, vary, or contradict the terms. So under the Willison view, the job is to be finished on July 4th. Under the Corbin view, Corbin says you can look for what was the real intent of the parties. Did they really intend for this writing to be their final and complete expression? And this writing, they originally probably intended for it to be the right, because Pratt thought the writing was going to be signed on the same day, and he wrote the contract 30 days from the making of this contract, thinking that would be June 30th or July 1st. That's what Pratt thought. But when the contract wasn't signed on that day, because Delta sent it back later, then Pratt really didn't intend for the writing to apply. It's like writing a contract where one of the terms of the contract is you say the word today in the contract, meaning that very day when you thought the contract was going to be signed, and then it's signed a few days later, and the today doesn't have the same meaning anymore. And so they started out thinking that this writing was their final and complete expression, but really maybe it wasn't. And finally, under the Corbin view, Corbin says, look for the real intent of the parties. And I think the real intent is they did not intend for this writing to be final and complete anymore after they had, after the contract wasn't signed on the same day. They no longer intended for it to be their final and complete expression. So this writing may or may not be integrated depending on whether you follow Willison or the Corbin view. Next, let's look at the ambiguity issue. Well, you can make an argument here that there is ambiguity because the 30 days from the making of this contract, the one party interpreted that to mean July the 4th, and the other party interpreted that to mean June the 1st, because from the date of making of this contract got changed. So you could claim that the term is ambiguous. If you claim it's ambiguous, you look for the intent of the parties to resolve the ambiguity. In this case, the intent of the parties, they told you at line 8, Pratt emphasized, please finish by July the 1st. Mistake, you can argue that what is written on the paper is no longer what the parties intended. What is written on the paper is no longer what the parties intended, and that maybe this mistake is so severe, maybe it goes to a basic assumption of the contract. When mistakes go to the basic core nature of the contract, and the mistake has a material effect, then there is no contract. So you can make an argument that that's what you have here, possible mistake. If there is a mistake, arguably they just don't have a contract. In that case, Delta will get paid quasi-contract, and there will not be a breach of contract because there was no contract. So, formation, mutual assent, they agreed, consideration, yes, No effective defense, there's no interpretation, something to say about all three of these. Changes in the contract, no. They didn't try to modify the contract, they didn't change the people, so you don't have any of those changes. Then we go over to the next board, and we have breach. Well, let's keep reading. Line 24. Delta's crew began installing the equipment on June the 20th. And by July the 28th, had installed 5 of the 6 coolers with the pressurization and calibration complete. Well, what we're going to have here, since they had installed 5 of the 6 coolers, is there a breach. Pratt is going to sue Delta saying you breached, and Delta will say, well, we at least substantially performed. Let's talk about substantial performance. Let me suppose that I am building a house for you and it has a garage. And I have done everything that I'm supposed to do, including building the garage. But you know what? The front door swings open counterclockwise, and the plans called for it to swing open clockwise. And so now when I come to you to get paid, a condition precedent to your duty to pay me is that I have done what the contract said. And if I haven't done it, you'll say, the condition precedent, this condition precedent right here, the condition precedent to your duty to pay me has not occurred. Therefore, you don't have to pay. Well, you can see the problem. Any significant structure that is built, you can always go through that structure and find some minor item that is not exactly what the contract called for. And so if I built a 50-story building for you, this could go on for years and I would never get paid. So how do we deal with that? Well, what we do is we say, well, it's true, the condition preceding to your duty to pay me has not occurred, but if it has been excused, we will treat it as though it has occurred. That's what happens when a condition has been excused. One way to excuse a condition is by substantial performance. Now, whatever substantial performance means, it surely would include the case where I have built your house and the only discrepancy is that the front door swings open the wrong way. It can be easily fixed. And so clearly I have substantially performed. And what the rule is then is that when I have substantially performed, and we'll talk about the details of that in a minute, but if I have substantially performed, then that excuses the condition that I actually perform. So now you have to pay me. But the rule goes on to say it does two things. When I have substantially performed, it excuses the condition that I actually perform, and it permits you to pay me the contract price minus whatever it takes to fix that door in my house case. So you pay contract price minus what it takes to correct whatever the discrepancies are. Now, so the problem then becomes, how do you decide if I have substantially performed? Don't you agree that in the case where Delta has installed 5 of the 6 coolers, and they're operating just the way they're supposed to, that there's an argument, at least, that Delta has substantially performed? And the bar examiners wanted you to present that argument. Well, how do you decide whether or not someone has substantially performed? Well, first of all, let me make it clear that if I have only substantially performed, I built your house, but I got the door opening the wrong way, that I have breached the contract, no question about it. But it is a minor breach, not a material breach. And in the case where I have substantially performed, the other side of substantial performance is minor breach. If I have only substantially performed, I have always committed a minor breach. And you hold back the damages for that minor breach. Now, so how do you decide if I have substantially performed or if the gap between what I did and what I was supposed to do is so large that I have not even substantially performed? Well, there are two ways to do that. Two ways to decide over here when there has been substantial performance. I work two branches here in my diagram. One way is the common law standards, the other is the restatement. The common law branch right here would say, I have substantially performed if you have received the substantial benefit of your bargain. Whatever you bargained for, the house I was supposed to build for you, surely you have gotten the substantial benefit of your bargain when you got everything except the door opening the wrong way. And since you have gotten the substantial benefit of your bargain, I have substantially performed, but I've committed a minor breach. You pay me the contract price minus what it takes to get the door fixed. In the case of the coolers, if I have properly installed 5 of the 6 coolers, you can make an argument that the meat company has received the substantial benefit of their bargain. They got 5 of the 6 coolers there, and therefore they should pay me the contract price, pay Delta the contract price, $12,000, minus whatever whatever it takes to fix the minor damages, whatever it takes to get someone to install the 6 cooler. Now, in that case, of course, if time was all that important, and it looks like it was, then when Pratt says, Delta, you've committed a minor breach, well, Pratt can say, not only am I going to withhold the money it takes to get the 6th cooler installed, but I have also been damaged by your not having here for the 4th of July. And if that damage meets the Hadley versus Baxendale standard, foreseeable when the contract was formed, then Pratt is entitled to not only the cost of getting the 6th cooler installed, but also the foreseeable damage. So if you use that as your standard for substantial performance, the common law rule, substantial benefit of the bargain, the restatement view of how you determine that has 6 factors to it. And I'm not going to recite those 6 factors now. They're in your materials. So you may use those 6 factors, which is the somewhat more sophisticated way of deciding if the person has substantially performed. So you apply those, and if the person has substantially performed, once again, there's a minor breach, and the non-breaching party pays contract price minus those damages. So in our case, let's continue with the reading. We pick up where we left off at line 24. Line 24, Delta's crew began installing, and they got 5 of the 6 of them in. Line 25, the crew was having trouble with installing the last cooler, and the crew chief decided that a special valve fitting was needed to complete the job. Now it's now June the 28th, and I think they're supposed to finish by July 1st, but of course Delta is going to say we have until July 4th, but I don't think so. The crew chief ordered the fitting from a supplier, line 27, and stopped work on the installation of the last cooler pending arrival. It arrived on July 2nd. Well, I think they're in breach already, but you see the problem. The crew and his chief went immediately out to the market, but Pratt refused to allow them to finish the job. Now, Delta is going to say, we have until July 4th to finish. I don't think they do, but that's their argument based on the parole evidence rule. We have until July 4th to finish, and we came out to finish on July 2nd, and you prevented us from completing. And if you prevented us from completing, then that is an excuse. It excuses the condition precedent that we finished by July 4th. We would have finished, but you prevented us. And since you prevented us from finishing, you treat it as though we did finish, to excuse, and pay us. Of course, Pratt will say, we didn't prevent you from finish, you were already in breach at that point. And we didn't let you finish because it would make a mess. We were selling to our customers, and we needed to mitigate damages at that point. Pratt will say that all conditions preceding to your duty had occurred. There weren't any. Time for your performance had arrived, June 1st. Your duty had not been discharged by any of these things. You might mention the impossibility, but the mere fact that these people had to get their parts from someplace else is not objective impossibility. And therefore, Pratt will say, Delta, you have breached. And the dispute over breach we've talked about. Pratt will say, pay us damages. Well, Delta will say, even if we breached, it was a minor breach, because we substantially performed. But even if it was a minor breach, I think everyone would agree it's probably a minor breach. But even if it's a minor breach, Pratt will say, we're entitled to all damages which were foreseeable when the contract was formed. The damages which were foreseeable include whatever it's going to cost us to get someone else to install these, plus our losses in the retail of the use of the fixed cooler. Our damages from that. Well, let's see how it goes from here. Pratt claims that the opening was ruined in line 34. Line 32. Line 32. Pratt had arranged the grand opening of his new market for July 1st and 2nd in anticipation of a demand for beef, fish, and chicken on the 4th of July weekend barbecues. Pratt claims that the opening was ruined because of the messy appearance of the partly assembled cooler, and that he had lost sales because the cooler was unavailable for fresh display he had planned for an opening. Pratt had ordered his butcher to discard the fresh fish, for which he had paid $1,500 because he could find no cold storage for it. He tried unsuccessfully to contact Delta on July the 1st. Line 39, Pratt claims that Delta has breached their contract. Pratt refuses to pay Delta any money and sues Delta for $2,500, which was the retail price of the fish that were discarded. Well, Pratt sues. Has Delta breached? The answer is probably a minor breach. What damages is Pratt entitled to for the minor breach? Well, Pratt is entitled to all damages which were foreseeable when the contract was formed, but Pratt also has a duty to mitigate damages. So the cost of getting the cooler installed is whatever that is. Probably there's 6 coolers at probably $2,000 a piece, since there's $12,000. So the cost of getting the last cooler installed, the loss of the fish is a problem, because the loss of the fish is a problem because he shouldn't have ordered the fish if he didn't have a place to store it. Pratt has a duty to mitigate damages, and ordering fish which he knows he doesn't have a way to store might be a breach of the duty to mitigate damages, even if that he mitigated damages somehow. If he paid $1,500 for the fish and had to destroy it, I'm not sure that's true. Maybe but they said he couldn't find any other way to save it. So he's entitled to the $1,500, but is he entitled to the $2,500? In other words, he expected to sell it for $2,500. Well, Pratt is going to have to establish that these fish would have been sold if the cooler had been there. And this is a new market, a new opening. It would take a lot for him to prove that the only reason the fish were not sold is because they didn't have the 6 coolers. Finally, Delta might claim that this is a divisible contract. It is a divisible contract because there are 6 coolers, $12,000. Each one has an independent use by itself, and that this contract should be looked at as coolers for $2,000 a piece. And therefore he should be paid $10,000 for the 5 that were installed, and then try to collect what he can on the last one. And that's pretty much the end of the analysis of this question. Let's take a short break. I'm going to take about a 2 or 3 minute break. You can stop the process and take whatever break you like. We'll come back, we'll do the question from the February '91 bar, the text data question.